The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Great. People are already telling me the sound is good. Can you see my screen? I've actually had some computer troubles getting this loaded. I think GoToWebinar is just getting hit hard these days, obviously, with everybody working from home. So hopefully this will all work okay. Just doing a final setup. All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. All right, that's all the usual check-ins. I just got to delete all that out of the help questions. And as usual, I'm stalling for a minute or two as I see a whole lot of last-minute joins. No big deal. We don't mind. Webinars, what's happening is our webinars are selling out. I guess selling out. They're free. But it does have a churn. It kind of lets some extras in, and it is full at this stage, so I am going to get started. Okay, well, welcome to today's webinar on building better intervals with WKO5. My name is Tim Cusick, and I am the TrainingPeaks WKO product leader. The reality is we're going to spend a little time working on, and I'm turning off things on my screen. Keeps warning me the webinar's full. Today we're going to be working on intervals and going over a little overarching discussion about intervals. Throughout this presentation, please feel free to ask questions as we go. I pretty much say this every webinar for those of you who join them all. I like to answer the questions as we go in these more interactive webinars. I think it really gives everybody a chance to see something. Oh, I have a question on that. Get your question in and I'll answer it at the time. The reality is, if you just type a question in this box, I tend to get it or blend it into the presentation itself. Now, quick overview about today's webinar. The reality is, I'm just doing a summary. And sorry, you guys, I always hesitate in the beginning. What happens a lot in the beginning is people message me like, I can't hear or something. If everybody can generally hear me, which we know is true, and everybody can generally see the screen, which we know is true, it's probably your computer. So just, I know that might be frustrating to you, but don't keep messaging me on it. It's hard to keep track of all those messages and do the webinar. Cool, thanks. All right, so today's webinar. So really, I'm just going to give a summary and WKO5 use-focused presentation, because the reality is there are some really good interval webinars out there. I loaded this presentation to the handout section in that gray box on the top right-hand corner. You can download it directly. I will also link it into the when I post it on YouTube, or you can always email us for it at info@wko5.com, right? And why it might be important for you to get this presentation is it has the direct links to these 4 great interval webinars. When I sat down to do this webinar, I was really hard because I was like, man, I did that. I almost started stealing slides from my other webinars. And it was like, that's, not the best way to do it. I don't want to interrupt or recreate those. So this list, if you go back, I would highly recommend after you listen today. Mine's a little bit more about overarching, summary, targeting, and use case, and I'll get into some discussion if you guys want in the Q&A. But if you really want to get deep into it, these 4 webinars are the ones you want to watch. I did one on the art and science of interval training. Dean Golich did a 2-part series on interval training, very good. First one's more about interval analytics, and then the second part about prescription. And Coley Moore did one on releasing the power of sprint training, where he did a lot of discussion about interval training for sprints and sprint training itself. Those 4 are probably a deeper dive, but the reality is without the base knowledge I'm about to give you here, you won't be able to make that deeper dive. So this is really a pre-set up, a more basic summary approach to allow you to go on to those 4. If you've seen those 4, we probably won't get much deeper than what those 4 are. I'm not going to dig into any of the specifics or too much of the specifics, But in the end, if you want to ask your question in the Q&A, I'll stay on as long as anybody wants and talk data and analytics, intervals, whatever you want to talk about. All right, so here we go. Let's start out. When we start about talking intervals, it's important that, I get into this discussion a lot, and I wanted to take this opportunity in this one to talk about, when we talk about training and the scale of importance of training, right? I have this kind of my own mental view, which I tried to record on this little diagram here, and it's important for me to point it out here. And if you think about kind of coming from the bottom up, of things that are important, training with purpose and knowledge, that's the most important to me. You gotta have a reason. You gotta have, don't get me wrong, your reason can just be general fitness, but the more you want to perform, the more that needs to be specific. Then you need to build training consistency. Then you need to progress training load. Then you need to find your training rhythm. And actually, I can see these two flipping. I go back and forth on that, right? But only way up here on the top, and the top, maybe a pyramid wasn't the right way to discuss it or to show this. Learning to appropriately target your intervals and write good intervals is important. But to be honest with you, on this list, it's probably the least important. And I know that's like sacrilegious to say, but I get into this discussion a lot. And sometimes in the Facebook group and this and that, I don't answer questions in depth because focus on these areas first. As you learn to coach and self-coach or whatever direction, you build your own educational process of coaching, right? It really is what you see on the bottom side of this pyramid that's most important. This, don't get me wrong, you got to get it right. It's absolutely part of improving and doing it great. But at the end of the day, what I see out of a lot of young coaches or self-coach athletes, and excuse me for saying this phrase, right? But rushing to an answer, they rush right to, it's all about the targeting. I need to know if I should do 320.5 watts or 321.2 watts. And the reality is that is not as important as building your overarching knowledge about, training with purpose, how to build consistency, how to progress load. And there's more to it. I'm sure everybody knows that. I'm just summarizing points. Finding that training rhythm, then target comes up there. So the reality is, just as we jump in, I want to make that stated that as we talk about interval targeting, to me, I have a pretty clear process, but I focus more on the bigger things and executing good intervals than I do allowing the interval to designate the training strategy. If you want to write a note down about improving your coaching, that's a good one right there. Because if you read a lot of what we see posted on Facebook and what I see as questions, people are looking for the interval answer because that is their strategy defined. And I think you need to step back and take a deeper look. That being said, we're going to focus on that targeting. We're going to focus on those areas and do some work right there because it absolutely is the difference of getting your athlete performance from 95% of peak to 100% peak. That is really where that, targeting, that high-end interval knowledge helps. So let's start with some basics. What is interval training? Well, basically it's physical training that involves a series of low to high intensity exercise workouts interspersed with a rest or relief period. So really it's kind of go hard, go easy, right? So that's pretty much intervals. It's almost more easily explained in a visual format. Hard, easy, hard, easy. That really is what interval training is. Now, interval training really came about, and if you watch my Art and Science of Intervals, I give you some history about the history of the physiology, even all the way back to caveman days. But it is about the idea of, you are basically utilizing intervals to replicate a high performance state. And in that replication, what you're using intervals is to maybe even extend that high performance state in an effort to force a proper adaptation to that state. So intervals give you the ability to mimic a race performance speed, a peak performance effort, a max power, whatever, intervals can be based on different things. But it gives you that ability, and by interdispersing that high effort with low effort and rest, you could add more training load in those specific intensities than you would be able to normally, therefore force more adaptation. Basically, that is the core of an interval. Now, what is the purposeful of an interval? Here's an oversimplification, but you know what? This goes back to my point about interval targeting, where be careful you're not thinking about it so deeply it drives your whole strategy. It's not the strategy. Intervals are a tool. And I have 4 areas I break all mine down into. Either I want to raise power, or I want to build capacity, or I want to build fatigue resistance, or I want to achieve a specific purpose. Whenever I write an interval workout, which we're going to talk through here later in the workout, purpose is where I start, right? What am I really trying to accomplish? And that purpose often falls in a periodization realm, like when and what is the development, what's this training strategy overall type of approach. But yet every interval workout that I sit down and do, I think purpose first, and then I try to write the best interval workout to meet that purpose. This is an oversimplification, like I said, but not really. That's pretty much the core. We're going to have some talk about modality and neuromuscular capability and environment, but at the core, this is what you're looking at. When you think about that interval purpose and getting it right, what's really the end goal? And I preach this frequently. You want the highest amount of adaptive strain versus the lowest amount of fatigue. As a coach and a self-coached athlete, the more you find that reality, the more you create that element in your workouts and in your training rhythm, the better you are. And that's really a matter of individualizing. It's the science and art of using the data and the analytics. But interval training as a whole, that's exactly what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to get the perfect amount, the highest amount of adaptive strain for the lowest amount of fatigue. The more, the better you do that, the more likely it is that you could deliver, good interval training. Next, you want specificity of the adaptive strain. You want to send the right signal. So the reality is, when we talk about specificity of the adaptive strain, are you targeting a specific metabolic response, an energy system? Do you need a specific accomplishment like a 6-minute climb, a 3-minute climb, a 20-minute climb, whatever it is? But we want to use intervals to help us accomplish something with specificity, meaning the goal is specific, and therefore the interval is designed with specificity to accomplish that desired response. And then finally, we want to be able to have that same effect on the training rhythm. So when you start talking about intervals, one of the problems that I also see is we talk about an interval workout in the singular, when we also should be talking not only about the density of work in that workout, but the density of work in cycles and the rhythm it comes. Whenever we think about interval training, we really also have to remember forest for the trees. How does it fit into the overarching training strategy? And how does it help us achieve goal or point number 1 up here? Most adaptive strain for lowest amount of fatigue. Now, I pulled this next slide from the art and science presentation. I think it's in that one, I'm almost sure. You can look at it in there. And I just wanted to give the idea of different intervals over time. I go much deeper in that presentation, but the reality is, in an oversimplified way, for those of you who are familiar with my training, my periodization, I tend not to get a bunch of macro cycles. I kind of think about this overarching theory of base and foundation into performance training. I use different intervals and different goals throughout that time period. And I kind of put together this little chart. And again, I go deeper in it in the art and science of intervals. You might want to look it up. But this will give you a general idea of how long or kind of what type of intervals I'm doing in general during a periodization plan. If you're a coach or a self-coached athlete, before you even as part of you write your annual training strategy, taking the time to think something like this out can be very, very effective. The reality is it kind of gives you some structure and thinking about things before you actually get into them. Okay, when we begin to get into today's presentation, now I'm going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty. Let's call that the introduction. One of the things I want everybody to know is that there is a WKO advanced interval targeting view that'll have everything in I'll show today. Some of the things I show today are available in multiple views, but you can always see what view you're in here. It's up here, WKO5 Advanced Interval View. And you could always, through this button, look and, and just choose a new view. You can look at the interval targeting view. There's different dashboards in here. I'm just kind of showing different dashboards. So everything I'm about to show and get into a little bit deeper is in here. Second, I'm going to take this from the approach of cycling. There is relevancy to all of this to the approach for running, and there is some relevancy for the approach for swimming, but yet there is individualization to that, and there is more specific focus to that. You definitely want to be working with your specific power duration curves to look at these individual targeting formats. And then in some areas for running, because running doesn't quite have the same efficiency of cycling, I would say there's some elements that you need to tweak. I'll try to give a couple of hints on those, but really that's well taught by Steve Palladino. There is a running with power webinar that talks about intervals too, so you might want to take a look at those deeper. Okay, let's get in. Let's start with interval targeting formats. Let's start with the basics right here, right? Within WKO5, you have optimized intervals, eye levels, and curve under the curve. I started with optimized intervals because the reality is optimized intervals are specifically targeted intervals based on your unique physiology. I've gone over this in multiple webinars. By using the model, we see points of impact or strain or parameters of your model, right? Which gives us an excellent understanding of areas where if you worked out this intensity in this duration range, you would probably have the maximum response. Now, if you watch Dean Golich's 2 webinars, right off the start in part 1, I think he makes a great quote, not just because we designed optimized intervals. Dean and myself and Kevin and Andy Coggin kind of worked through, we designed them together. But Dean says right off the bat in his presentation, optimized intervals will get you 95% of the way there. That is totally true. I mean, the reality is I'm super proud of what we did with optimized intervals. If you're properly maintaining your model, optimized intervals give you unique insight into specific workouts, specific targeting. I shouldn't say the workout itself, but specific targeting to the areas of each of that physiology or desired physiological response that will give you the greatest bang for the buck. Go back to my highest adaptive strain for least amount of fatigue. Optimized intervals can be found in any of the zone charts, and they tend to look like it's this chart. I put the red and blue box there, red and purple box there for discussion. And this is what it will look like. Now, it's important to note it has 2 halves. The left half of optimized intervals is all of your model-derived metrics, and the right half, Dean Golich and I designed these. And this is just some basic recommendations as far as reps, total time and zone, and not just guesswork. I mean, there's a lot of science behind this. Dean and I did a lot of time kind of researching what it really takes here. But the reality is it's just guidance. One of the things I see is we get a lot of focus on the right-hand side. I'm going to talk about some best practices here shortly on that right-hand side and how to design, optimize. I'll even give some insights into it here. Here are the different zones. Now, you notice we don't have optimized intervals below FTP. The reality is for tempo and things like that, there really is no optimization, just your regular training, your eye levels to tempo target, your classic levels. Once we're really below threshold as human beings, we all perform in a pretty tight range. It doesn't need a lot of individuality. So even though we could do it, the variances would be 1 or 2 or 3 watts here and there. It wouldn't be enough to matter. Excuse me while I take a drink. But as we get into FTP and above, we see these matter. So we've kind of broken FTP, FRC, which is your anaerobic, I should have done the metabolism. Watch the Art and Science where we'll talk about some anaerobic glycosis here. And then your Pmax here, so your max sprint, your neuromuscular power, right? And what we give in the definition of each one of those is you get a target time, and you get a target high watts and a target low watts. So high watts, low watts, right? So let's just start there and let's case study this a little bit, a very simple case study. So if this athlete, Jane Ryder, if I'm like, man, I want to really raise their FRC FTP, which really is your maximum aerobic capability. We broke out max aerobic versus as a specific subset of FRC FTP, really to focus on at what point are you truly what point are you running at 100%, VO2 capacity. So this athlete, and we classically refer to those as VO2 max intervals. This athlete would need to do 3 minutes and 54 seconds each interval, somewhere between 306 and 286 using optimized intervals. So about a 20-watt range, which for intervals at VO2 max intervals, that's a reasonably tight range. Some of the problems with classic ranges is the range can be too big, right? But this gives us a pretty tight range. Now, would I prescribe a 3 minute and 54 second interval? No, I would round that to 4 minutes. But then I would use these target watts. Now, what you see over here in recommendations, right, is we're looking for the reps to be progressive, but somewhere between 3 to 8 reps. And I get this question all the time. Well, which is it? 3 or 8? What do I do, right? So the reality is, you have to know your athlete, right? This goes back to one of the bullets I put in the description of this is how, what your data tells you about your athlete's intervals. Look at their history, right? And if they can only do 4, if they can only do 3, right? That's all they can do. Dr. Coggin used to say, all you can do is all you can do, right? So the reality is, if they're capable of doing 4, so 4 times 4 minutes in this example, or maybe even 3 times 4 minutes in this example, that's the starting point of your progression. And then you want to progress forward in your training. Meaning if they could do 3 today, have them do 3 today and 3 on Saturday's workout. I don't even know what's today, Wednesday, 3 on Saturday workout or whatever your next interval workout, then progress maybe to 4. The trick is, and I'll go over this more deeply, is we're giving a range of reps. You have to find the athlete starting point that they can handle and hit the targets and handle with pretty good quality. Not that they're not on the ragged edge in that last one, don't get me wrong, but they can hit the targets. Then progress interval, the number of intervals or total time and zone, which I'll talk about deeper later. The total time and zone is what you're targeting here. So in a broad range for VO2 max intervals, you want to accumulate a total between 12 and 30 minutes of interval work. That means if I'm doing 4-minute intervals, 3 times 4 is the minimal amount of prescription that I would want to make. And 8 times 4, 9 times 4 is the max basically that I want to make. So it wants to fall in that range. And then finally, the recovery ratio is 1-to-1 as an estimate. So I'm going to give you an example, right? One of the athletes I work with yesterday was actually doing some really hard VO2 max. We're doing a cycle, season's delayed, classic stories, pro rider. But we wanted to raise some VO2 max here, take the advantage to raise the ceiling a little. She was out doing VO2 max work. And the reality for the VO2 max work is we needed to get more time at max. So basically what I did is I prescribed 3 times 4-minute intervals and then 3 times 3-minute intervals based off a very similar optimized interval you're seeing here. It is not this athlete, but based on a very similar one. And the reality is I wanted to get the real maximum effort. I wanted that athlete to achieve maximum time at the highest point of that optimized interval possible. So you can manipulate the time range, right? And this is where it's important to start thinking about, we always think about the right. Like I say 1-to-1, you're like, oh, a 4-minute interval means 4-minute rest. But understand you can manipulate the actual time of both to some degree also. I just use the optimized intervals as the starting point, I guess is a good way to say it. So the reality is, I think that it gives a good example. You as the coach and the self-coached athlete, focus on the reps, right? but total time and zone drives the boat. So you can shift the modality. You can be able to, for some reason, people are so rigid with intervals, right? It's got to be, for everyone has to be exactly 4 minutes and every rest has to be exactly 4 minutes. You can manipulate both a little. So be careful when you see something like a 1-to-1 ratio as an exact. It's a target. Now I got a good question I'm going to tackle here. I'm going to read the question out loud. So the question is, what would be max for duration target to exceed the recommended target? Let's say the intensive aerobic is 1944 while 20 minutes looks just fine. Is it okay to go to 25 minutes twice for the example to hit TIZ? Yes, it is. And as a matter of fact, remember, our total time and zone is a pretty good estimate of what you're looking for. So you can, how you get there, as long as you're kind of following the basic principles of kind of exercise is a general answer. But the reality is, if your intensive aerobic target is 19 minutes and 44 seconds, quoting this one here, right, and the time and zone is 90, if I did 4 times these and that equaled 100, is that good or bad? That type of thinking, that's fine. You can implement it that way to hit total time and zone. So I could say, wow, maybe the athlete could do 3, which would put me at 60 minutes. And that might be my prescription. But let's say they get more and more fatigue resistant or training and they can get all the way to 4. Should they? So here's how I would answer that question, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is I would not go much beyond the high-end target, because that goes back to, I didn't mean to go that far back, sorry, this point. You want the highest amount of adaptive strain versus lowest amount of fatigue, right? The reality is, when you look at the science of interval training, there's absolutely points of diminishing returns, which we are roughly giving you these points of diminishing returns. Now that's Dean and I and Kevin, and Andy kind of working through that as a group. But the reality is, again, heavily supported by science, but that doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean absolute right. And it doesn't mean, you as a coach working with an individual athlete might have a different answer. It's just our opinion. That's probably a pretty good case study and simple way of using optimized intervals. Note, I should have done that before, optimized intervals are based off the power duration curve, not FTP. They're based off your power duration curve. They're individualized to your specific physiology. Okay, let's talk about eye levels. I see a fair amount of questions adding up, and I will get to them in the presentation. So I'm not ignoring them. I just know it's going to come out. Eye levels. All right, let's talk about eye levels. Again, eye levels, I should have started this way in optimized intervals. Eye levels are not based off FTP like classic training levels, where it's 120% of your threshold. It's based off your entire power duration curve, right? Based off your entire power duration curve. Eye levels are simply this. I've selected eye levels for cycling. They are for running. There are eye levels for running that you can find and target. Make sure you're using the ones for your sport type, because it needs to be based off the appropriate data. We have more training zones. I've gone into this more in depth in other webinars. Watch Individualizing Your Training with WKO if you want a really in-depth of number of training levels and stuff like that. But what we're giving you for each is a power zone, low to high, right? You do get a percentage because that will match, even though you don't have sweet spot, but it will match your classic training levels. But as we get to FTP and above, we see also time ranges of targets. Now you'll notice if you look back to optimized intervals, they'll fit within these time ranges. So the reality is, if you think about it, and I should have done it the other way around, I guess in hindsight, did the eye levels first, but I thought optimized are kind of the easiest way of getting there. The reality is eye levels are just a more broad, like let's say their max aerobic said 354 or whatever that was. So you're saying, oh, I should do 4-minute intervals. But let's say in their race, they have this one 2-minute hill or 7-minute hill that they have to do really well on. So in the name of specificity, maybe you're changing how they're doing max aerobic or VO2 max kind of work to be able to help them get over that hill with strength. eye levels give that step down guidance. The perfect answer to building maximum aerobic capacity, which obviously would help them get over that hill, is the optimized interval. But because you don't want that much specificity or physiological specificity, you might need performance specificity or course specificity. You then can check down to eye levels. Eye levels are a broader set of optimized intervals where it gives guidance based again on the metabolic response, what you desire out of the metabolic response. These are pretty clean, and I don't think, I still get a fair amount of questions on this. A good question I did get is, would I use eye levels for 30 or 90 days? I always use eye levels for 90 days. But when I start a season, and if seasons overlap, you guys all know this is a problem, everybody who's used it for a while. So let's say you shut down your previous season in September, right? And then you start training again in November for the new season, right? 2021, let's call it. You have some carryover of data in there because the model is based off rolling 90 days. So for the first month or so, the first cycle or so of the new season, I'll use both 30 and 90. I kind of look back and forth and just make sure I don't have anything tainted. Once I get my baseline test in, I feel really good about my 30-day model as long as it's based on that baseline test. Once we get 30, 45 days into the season, I'm always using 90 days. So hopefully that answers the question. One of the questions I got that I missed on optimized intervals, and I get it a fair amount, so I'm going to go back to it. In the 1-to-1 ratio, somebody asked this question, in the reference to 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, do you wait until fully recovered, then start the clock on rest? No. So the answer is, let's say you're doing 4-minute intervals here. You do 4-minute intervals. The moment your 4-minute interval is over, the hard part, you go really hard, you hit your button, and then the 4-minute clock starts ticking. You need to start your next interval about 4 minutes after you finish the last one. All right, now let's talk about curve under the curve, because this has created some confusion, and it really is the system that I generally use. And it really, I have to be honest with everybody, I was using it before we created eye levels, and before we created optimized intervals. It was really how they came about, right? Because we wanted to just make it easier to understand. So I still use curve under a curve to a certain degree, because I taught myself that months, years really before WKO came out. I was using the model, and I was, I was using the model, and I was, using it to target this way. And basically what you have there in the advanced interval targeting, if you go into the dashboard, there's a series called interval targeting FTP, interval targeting FRC. And what you'll see is a power duration curve and 2 dashed lines. The dashed lines are an estimated high and low. And if you wanted to do who knows what I have here, an 8.5-minute interval selected, right? 8:36 actually. This would tell you that the athlete, if they were doing 8-minute intervals, the model suggests they can go 283 watts. At this percentage, they're doing repeats at 275 to 281. Now, here's what's really important. It's in actually the description of these models. Each athlete has a repeatable percentage. These are just set on an average. And if you looked at the expression, it's just basically the power duration curve times 0.95, right? That gives you 95% of the power duration curve. So I have some athletes who can't maintain more than 85% in interval workouts of their of their power duration curve. Whereas then I have other athletes that can maintain 95% of their power duration curve. So the reality is I do set up my individual athletes with a high-low curve based on experience. Now that's probably more work than it's worth, to be honest with you guys. And I've gotta be true. I'm using optimized and the eye levels more and more because it's just not worth maintaining this extra step. But I've always maintained it as far as the views and talk about it because it's really where eye levels and optimized intervals come from. And if you think about it, you can see the natural progression. I still like this for unique scenarios. To be honest with you, one of the key reasons I still cling to it is I have an athlete who performs in a very specific time range. It tends to be around between 33 and 45 minutes. Like all of their events that they need to be super good at are time trials in that range, right? So there's some specificity that far out that I like to use in this type of thinking. But again, I'm just showing it to you, your decisions to be made. All right, now that we understand the 3 targetings, and I was trying to answer all the targeting questions, I got a fair amount of other questions that I think I'm generally going to come to, but I was trying to just look through any specific targeting questions, which I think I got them all. Okay, so now let's move to interval workout strategy. The rest of you, I think I'll generally get to your questions. Interval workout strategy. So when you start thinking about interval workout strategy, 3 things you think about: purpose, density, and modality. So let's start with purpose. Same chart I showed you from the beginning. I don't have a big difference in that. It really is the system. Now, I do consider 2 things in all of these, right? Neuromuscular manipulation. Are we trying to create a specific or utilize neuromuscular manipulation techniques to create a specific adaptation within the interval? Now, when I say something like neuromuscular manipulation, it's like, ooh, that sounds complex. You could just call it cadence. The reality is, are we doing these at high cadence, low cadence? Are we looking to build force pedaling? Are we looking to build neuromuscular response, neuromuscular power? You really, when you think about all intervals, and as a matter of fact, I got, one of the things that I think coaches could do better is introducing more cadence and cadence specificity into their interval work. Cadence is a way to not only manipulate that neuromuscular response, it also can have some other effects through that manipulation. Doing, 4 times 4 minutes, the optimized intervals I was talking about before, at 100% cadence, spinning it out on a flat, is a different neuromuscular manipulation than doing that same workout at 65 to 75 RPMs up a 8% grade, right? And not only is that true in the specific adaptation, that is also true in the training rhythm, the fatigue that brings with it, the style of fatigue, and other factors. So neuromuscular manipulation should be part of your consideration. And then also there's fatigue status and management. Do I want to be utilizing, will this athlete have a reason, or maybe a better way, is there a purpose to be utilizing intervals to improve fatigue resistance, to improve the capability of that athlete to go and be able to perform late in an event? If you're a professional cyclist, that's obviously pretty important. You need fatigue resistance, and not only do you need fatigue resistance, you need to be able to do maximum efforts late in a ride, typically, or at least depending on who you are and what you're riding. And the reality is, if that's you, you can use fatigue status and management. And basically what I'm saying there is, should you do intervals late in the workout? Well, if you do them late, you're not going to hit the same maximal power, but you already have a certain amount of fatigue, you have a certain amount of work in the system, you have a certain amount of fiber recruitment that's already gone on, has different effects. So the reality is you could use that. The other one I never put in here, and since somebody already asked me about running, and I just have to get more thoughtful about running, it really just isn't my expertise, so I tend to avoid it. I was a runner in high school and college, so it's not like most of us, I didn't come from there. But in running, it really brings about something that should be in this cycle for everybody, is skills, right? Intervals, I was having this discussion with somebody yesterday, and doing intervals on a trainer. One of the questions I got about in this question set is about erg mode. But when you're on a trainer, when you're doing intervals, excellent time to build skills. And what are skills? When I say skills, you immediately think bike handling, right? But in running, it's gait and efficiency. It also is things like breathing, mental focus and relaxation. All those little things, right? Also are times, and they should be part of your thinking. I should have put them in here. When it comes to interval purpose, This interval purpose grid is just a rough summary of some thinking. This is in the Art and Science of Intervals webinar that's linked up front. And I'm not going to go over it all, but it typically gives you those purposes, what you're looking for in some intervals. And it gives this idea of, what should be the format. Like if you want to raise power, you can typically, and if you get into the life cycle of training, you could raise your max powers for 1 to 4 straight years. Maybe even more if your skills get better or some efficiency. But the reality is, let's say you perfectly trained, each year you had the perfect coach and you trained perfectly each year, you could continue to make improvement for years, depending on your age, more than 4. Just take that as an average. But, you can, a middle-aged cyclist doing that probably can continue to improve for 4 years. Capacity building is a little longer. Ability to fatigue. So you have tons and ability to improve. This just gives some ideas. Watch that webinar if you want to get into it deep. And it should work. All right, let's talk about interval density. I've had a bunch of questions about how many intervals you should do. I don't really give specific feedback on how many days should you do interval workout. I've had that question 3 or 4 times, I think, in some in the public, some in the private questions. The reality is it really depends on your training maturity here. I did that backwards. Okay, so it depends on your training maturity. So what I mean by training maturity is how many years have you been training seriously in running, or how many years you've been training seriously in cycling. One of the things I think that is a massive mistake for newer cyclists and newer runners, they get into the sport, they immediately get jacked up on riding hard, and they do 4 interval days a week, 5 interval days a week. A newer cyclist who doesn't have that efficiency yet probably, in my opinion, only needs 2. So 2 higher, red is intensity, 2 higher intensity days a week. Because the reality is, more than that, you're probably just creating fatigue and no increase in adaptation. You probably only need 2 good interval days once interval season comes. Remember that seasonality point I made and the chart I showed you about different intervals and different times of the season. But the reality is that newer athlete probably only needs 2 days of interval work. Anything beyond that, assuming a normal training schedule that looks, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, which you see here, 4 days a week, maybe that Friday they're off. Any additional training after that probably is just more fatigue. You might be getting 1% more gain and 5% more fatigue. So your real performance change is you lose performance. As that athlete matures, they get 1 to 2 years of training. I would go up to 3. I know that there's a lot of people in the 80-20 polarized world would say, well, that's too many. Not really. If you really read into polarized, I don't, and who it was written for, sports that don't have quite the efficiency of cycling, I would go more. I think that the athlete for select time ranges of training, like the performance phase, 3 times a week is good. But that being said, even for the mature athlete, I might not ever go more than 3 times, but the reality is I might begin to block days differently. This athlete, the more mature athlete who's gained more efficiency and training kind of memory, right? They need a higher load. They need a higher adaptive signal. It's kind of funny. I call that, when I work with my athletes, I call that adaptive signal ringing the bell, right? Well, as you get better and better at training and more memory in there and more efficient and able to handle more work, you have to ring that bell louder and to get the body to respond. So I will move more to a block training approach, which can have a bunch of different looks. I'm just giving you, I wouldn't write this out like, oh, look, there's my perfect weekly schedule. There's other ways to block train. It really depends. Are they a stage racer versus a one-day racer, all that other stuff. But my point is, once they go 3 years plus, I still would not do more than 3 interval days a week. And even 3, understand, is kind of pushing the limit. That's one of the reasons why I wouldn't go much beyond the duration targets of each workout. Remember, I said that you have to have it as part of your training rhythm. Don't lose sight of the forest, looking at the trees. Don't lose sight of that forest. So that's basically density and how I look about it. Now, I've gotten enough questions that they're way off my screen. I can't keep up, so I will catch up with them in the end if I don't answer your question. Finally, there's modality, right? And modality is this very unique thing where you see a lot of discussion about it, and then people post a science paper on this works and a science paper on that works. And the idea of modality is there's different ways to do intervals, right? And I broke them down, same basic intervals here, but I just said, first of all, take the simplest thought approach when you begin to discuss modality, right? And just know you have two, in its simplest format, two metabolic responses that you're looking for. There's really three, and even those can be broken down, but let's just say there's two, aerobic and anaerobic, right? Well, when you start looking at aerobic interval modality and then separately anaerobic interval modality, you basically have this idea of when you're doing intervals aerobically, there's a steady interval, right? And what's a steady interval? It's the classic kind of top hat. I'm going to do 2 times 20 SST because my threshold is 300 watts. Therefore, I'm going to go 270 watts, no more, no less, 270 watts for 20 minutes, and then I'm going to rest for 5 minutes in between. Then I'm going to go 227 or 270 watts for 20 minutes, right? Bam. That's a steady state interval. You simply have a number, you're targeting at staying as tightly, as closely to that number as possible, and you do it. A repeated interval, Tabata, micro intervals, 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. That's another modality that of recently really has gained popularity. You have high intensity interval training, just super hard intervals, a form of Tabata, a form of micro, but they tend to stand out because, and even I put them here as aerobic because they're high intensity, which has shown and demonstrated could have an aerobic gain in people under severely limited time training schedules. A great way to build your aerobic engine is high intensity training. Like if you can't train more than 6 hours, 7 hours a week, I would use HIIT as your format. And then finally, what I call variable training. And variable intervals in aerobic training don't get used enough. And this is, you've seen some of my webinars, the TAN, tough as nails intervals, which Andy Coggan named. The reality is you can do, like let's say you're going to go out and do 90 minutes of tempo work, right? If I said to so many athletes, go out and do 90 minutes of tempo, they're going to do the math really quick, right? Well, I'm going to do it at 85% of my number. And that means that means my average needs to be 225 watts. And they're going to go out for 90 minutes and they're going to try to be as smooth as possible at 225 watts, right? Why? Why is that the right answer? When you tend to then go to the Saturday group race or your weekend racing and it's, blah, and slow down, blah, slow down. Do some of your aerobic work in a simple variable format. And that's what TAN is. Just mix it up. A TAN workout is, it's funny. I used to always train this way back in the day before I formalized, and this was way back in the day. I just, before we had power, long before we had power, I would just have this course where, I had a long and a short course, and the long course took me 3 hours and the short course took me 90 minutes. And I would ride the 90-minute course as hard as I could, which in the beginning season would take me 100 minutes. And when I was rounding in form, I'd be 88 minutes, right? And the way I would do that is it was a changing course with rolling hills and, 35 turns on it. I'd attack out of the turns. I'd attack over the hills. I'd just do everything I could to make, in the end of the day, once I got a power meter and I would do my TAN ride, I didn't call it TAN it that way. Andy Coggan used to do the same, and he had the same way of training. So he was the one who had the name. Then once I got a power meter and started measuring it, every time I would do that, guess what it was? Tempo. So, there's different, you can do tempo that way. I'm not saying at this time in the science of which one works best, but the reality is I'm going to give you some insight in a slide. And the same generally is true, right? I tend to call max, HIIT, or there's an element of just when you're doing anaerobic building, just maximal sprint. And I know somebody was talking about AWC and glycotic response, but that's what max is, just max neuromuscular power development. And there's HIIT training here also, but I call that sprint interval training, here because you're slightly more purposeful on the anaerobic side. But here's the general secret, right? With all of these modalities, Numerous studies have shown that the variation of interval modality does not significantly increase results, meaning we haven't yet connected, not enough research connects that choosing one modality over another modality will consistently give you better results. And that takes some time to sink in because we like to have a lot of discussion about modality. But at the end of the day, everything comes full circle, right? You're starting to see more research coming back and say, you know what? It's really just coming down to time and zone, like how long you're working hard, and is that an appropriate balance, meaning not too little, not too much. And I think we're going to keep seeing more research and more research the next year or two go back that way to this simpler, don't worry about all these different modalities. It really is about achieving time and zone, which in my opinion, and everybody, just to say it, these are all my opinions. I'm trying to give you a little bit of the science behind it, but it's still opinion. So in the end of the day, when it comes down to modality selection, I have a way of thinking about it. There's no one format is best, but where I want to get the format, the correctly selected modality is what does the athlete perform the best of. I have an athlete, or I used to have an athlete, professional mountain biker. He doesn't race anymore. Unfortunately, he ran into a tree and broke his neck. He's fine enough now, but he's retired. The reality is he couldn't do steady state intervals really well. So he'd go out and do a 4-minute interval, and he had a big engine. He could do 450 watts, 475 watts, but he just hated it and he'd struggle. Go out and give him, micro intervals, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, that type of deal. He'd go 25 watts harder, more every workout because he just loved to kill the short stuff. So great. He was producing better power. He could hit better numbers. We got better penetration into time and zone. He loved it. He was a totally wired, ready to go, attack anything kind of guy. So it suited him. Bam, worked. And in the end of the day, it met my goal of the modality. I want the athlete the most motivated and most capable of achieving the highest power in that time and zone. Okay. Let's talk about interval workout development. I just have a couple more slides and we'll get into the discussion. I know I skipped a lot of questions, guys. I couldn't keep up with them all. I'm going to try. I'll get back to them, I promise. So when I think about development of interval consideration, and I will tell you as somebody who does webinars and writing articles, I got to get back to writing articles, but I don't because it's so hard to simplify your thoughts and like, wow, here's a process that I've learned in 20 years and I'm going to get it into 750 words or into one slide. And then when you do that, you oversimplify everything. And then, 5 days later, somebody emails you like, well, you said this and that's not physiologically right, or that's not this. And I'm like, I know, right? I get it. These are how I do and approach things, right? And giving some insight into the way I do it, not because, and it's so important that everybody realizes what I'm about to say, just so I don't get those emails. I'm suggesting you think about how you build intervals. Take my slide, right, and write your own notes. Take a screenshot of this, print it out, and write your own notes. What am I doing? What is my order? As coaches, one of the great ways to learn is to self-analyze. What is my process? What am I going through? How am I getting to these conclusions? And once you do that, once you can formalize it, so to speak, you tend to improve it. Oh, but what if I did this over there? You actually watch me do it at times when I present. I should have put that slide first, right? We all do it once we do it. So this is mine. You should come up with yours. I think about purpose first, and that's strategic fit. Where does this tree fit in my forest? I always do that so I don't lose sight of what I'm really trying to do. Then I think, what are the desired results? It's so funny. People ask about intervals all the time online. And I'm like, well, what are you trying to accomplish? And they're like, well, and it becomes they don't really know. Is it a specific metabolic response? Is it a specific event response? What do you need out of those intervals? You have to be able to know that. Then I actually think about modality. And this goes right with what I just said. What does the athlete like the best? And that doesn't mean, by the way, I always give like this, the athlete example I was just giving the mountain biker. I didn't always give them micro style. Because if they only did them all microstyle, that's just focusing on their strengths and not really on any limiters. But I might give 2 out of every 3 would be micro. The third one would be steady. Go back and ping at where they're not quite as strong, right? But I want to lead towards that motivation with the athlete. I want the bulk of those to be in a way that motivates them and keeps them running strong. When modality, does that modality fit within an event, demand? So in that case, as a mountain biker, micro intervals fit pretty well because a lot of the courses they were racing were more technical kind of courses that off again, on again acceleration actually lined up very well, with the interval itself. So not only were they doing something that they were physiologically more capable of doing, he could put out more power in the micro intervals, psychologically more capable. It just jazzed him. He just wanted to attack stuff, and it made it great. And it was course specific. It was event specific. So there you have a good alignment. Totally worth targeting. And finally, what I call the perfection potential, right? Even though you got to be careful about perfection. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit of the wrap up. But the reality is, I also want to give the athlete I see my job as the coach to write the perfect interval work that they can accomplish. That's got to be part of what I'm thinking, so that when they ride home that day, it was so cool. I've been doing some VO2 max intervals with one of my other athletes who's getting a little older, and we're a little concerned about losing some VO2 max. Just went out and just have done a cycle of VO2 max just to raise the roof a little bit, and it's just been getting stronger every time they do them. And we've been very cautious about the interval format and how we do them, because I want that athlete to have the potential of, perfection. Now, in that discussion yesterday with the athlete, she said to me, and I was setting it up, and it's so funny. We've learned from each other so well. She's like, now, I was like, we're moving more and more. I want you to go all out. I want you to go all in on these intervals this time, right? I really want to see what you can do. And she's like, well, I think I'm nervous I would fail on the last one, but I guess that's by design, right? And I was like, yeah. So also understand, when I say perfection potential, that doesn't mean no failure. If you never fail, you're not trying hard enough, right? Its perfection is, I want you to fail. I want to see if we can get to that last one. And if you fail on the last one for this, reason, whatever, the interval set that we're doing, if that was our goal, then we've achieved success. So put that in your brain as potential. What are we, what is success in this interval? I do think about manipulations, environment. Is it hot? Is it cold? Or at altitude? All those things should come into play. For most of us, that really doesn't change much with the athletes, but if you have athletes that travel a lot, that's a big deal. You want the neuromuscular and neuromuscular manipulation and fatigue management. I already told you what those are. I think about, do I want these at a higher cadence, at a lower cadence? I might do VO2 max work in the winter with high cadence because I don't want the muscular demand. I might want the cardiovascular, more of it shifted to the cardiovascular side, but I don't want the heavy muscular demand load. And I might do VO2 max workouts as we get into the performance phase at a lower or a natural cadence, because I do want more muscular demand and shifting away some of the cardiovascular. So you have these neuromuscular manipulations that play a role in the intervals, and it might be something that you think about in your periodization of workouts. And you have fatigue management. Is there a reason I should be doing, fatigue resistance style work for this athlete? Do they have extended events? Do they need to be strong at the end of the event? What is it? Then once I've done all that, I think about targeting. I think about the targeting of the on phase, the duration of the on phase, the targeting of the off phase, and the targeting of the duration phase. I got a fair amount of questions about the targeting of the off phase, and that's a really good art question. I go in it pretty deep in the art and science of intervals, and I'll touch on it in the upcoming slide. And then finally, I think of time and zone progression. I want to go back. I always start with the history of similar workouts. Where were they? I mean, if I have to look at all last year and say, well, look, they were doing 3-minute intervals or 4-minute intervals, and they got up to be able to do 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever that number is, right? Does it fit within the physiological range, meaning the duration range I showed you in optimized intervals in this example, but if you did your research, you would find those are pretty typical ranges. So does it fit within that? Then I find what I can think the athlete does. We do that set of intervals. If they said that was easy, I could have done one more. We do one more, and that's our starting point, right? And then we're always progressing. And here's where I think, the challenge comes. One of the things I think all coaches really need to be thinking about, and I preach this, so, and again, it's covered in all of the interval webinars I recommended earlier, is you got to be progressive at all times. One of the things that Dr. Coggin taught me also, Andy was always pretty good at this, more so than you would think, right? You'd think the exercise physiologist would be a little more controlled and slower approach. His answer was ABP, like always be pushing. And the more, I couldn't agree more. It's been a proven learning lesson for me all my life. All my coaching life, because the reality is I see too many athletes sitting at a plateau, at a training plateau. They do that 4x4 minute work, right? And they do it Tuesday, and then they do it Saturday, and then they do it the next Tuesday, and they do it the next Saturday, and then do it the next Tuesday. And for a whole cycle, they're doing 4x4. Or maybe it's 7x1 minute if they're looking for, FRC kind of deal, or something like that. And they just do 7x1, 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 7x1. You've got to always be progressing. And this is a note you can take away, and I truly believe this with a passion, if you're repeating a workout twice, okay, that's all right. If you're repeating it a third time, too many. Any workout that you're repeating a third time, you're not being progressive enough. And what I mean by progressive is you need to add time and zone. Well, let's look at this. You need to increase the power. So let's say you were doing, in 2 times 20 SST. One of the choices you could make is to do it more power for 2 times 20. Not a great example because I would usually add time, but an example. So the way you could progress is you can increase the power target, or you can increase the time and zone, or you can use a manipulated rest period, right? So this is my last slide. So let's get into this in the Q&A, and I will go back and try to tackle all of this, but let me go a little deeper on what I mean here. So the reality is, right, every interval you write, you should be looking at the last interval that athlete did, the last interval set, right, workout they did, and always be progressing. If you do it right, it works well. So when I say that, like, what do you mean? I get this question and pushback a fair amount. Well, if every workout is harder, don't you just overtrain the athlete quickly? No. Overtraining is reasonably rare. You should be more concerned about non-functional overreaching, but that's in other webinars, right? But that being said, overtraining, the way you overtrain an athlete, most athletes, don't get me wrong, you could do it with people who are have a lot of hours to train a week. But I get this question all the time. I'll give you an example, jumping around a little now. Somebody's like, I train 10 to 12 hours a week and I feel kind of tired. Am I overtraining? No, you're not going to overtrain on 10 to 12 hours a week. Even with a high intensity approach, it's really, really hard to overtrain on 10 to 12 hours a week. The reality is what you're concerned about is training that you're not ready for. So the problem that you have when I say always be pushing, be progressive, is you haven't always been progressive. So if you go back to that slide where I was doing interval, I'll do it. Somebody's going to have a seizure, but we'll go the fast way. You're always doing intervals, right? And something's always progressing. So you're always progressing through an entire season. This is 20 weeks, or it might be 24 weeks just of the training time. It's not, riding all year, but it's training time. You're always progressing through something, right? So the reality is when you talk about always be pushing, you have to think about these different systems, how they build on top of each other. That's more the art and understanding the science and understanding periodization, or at least progression principle of exercise, the chronic view of that. And you're always building and progressing. So that's kind of my progression rule of intervals. If you can do the same interval workout 2 times in a row, After that, if the athlete isn't ready to progress, you've probably done your previous progression wrong. And you should try to find a way to get them moving forward. And look, they just might not be able to, right? They might just be hanging on by an absolute thread. Life might be stressful. There's always outside factors. So I'm talking about rule in the perfect environment, right? They could be going through life troubles or work troubles and not recovering. All of that is a reality to think about. But that should be your general principle of progression. Progress, progress, progress. Don't progress by doing more interval days. That's why I showed you density. That won't make you faster. Progressing your hard days. As your progression of hard days get really hard, make your other days easier, particularly in the realm of intensity, meaning, and that is the 80-20. You're now talking about at least the principle behind polarization, and that's very true. You know, if you do your hard day and then you're going to go an easier endurance day the next day and you turn it into tempo because you went to the local group ride, you're not going to do as well on the next interval set. After that, you're not going to be as recovered. Finally, you can manipulate rest period, right? So let's say you're capacity building, because it's easiest to understand in capacity building, and the typical place you would do this. And let's say you're doing, again, we'll talk about aerobic, and you're doing sweet spot work, and you're doing 3 times 20 minutes with 5-minute rest. And you only have 90 minutes a day to work out. That's all you have. So you really can't get in much more with a proper warm up and a cool down. You can't really get in much more sweet spot work. Manipulate the rest period. Take that 5 minutes down to 4, down to 3, down to 2, right? That's another way to progress strain, because the system recovery isn't as good in 2 minutes as it is in 5 minutes. So it is more strain. You can also manipulate that rest period by increasing power during it. Meaning, if you're normal, you're totally light spinning at 100 watts, which is what I typically would recommend. So a rule of thumb, because this question came up a couple of times. What are my power targets? What are my power targets in the rest periods? If the purpose of the interval is building power, right? So I want max power output. We're really, really targeting high power outputs. The watts during the rest period are 50 or less. Go uphill, coast downhill, right? Go uphill, coast downhill. That's an excellent example of a way to use an uphill in your intervals, use them to produce more power and power building intervals, and then also allow you to just spin your way downhill at 10 watts. So you're basically freewheeling, right? And then spin around at the bottom light and then go again. Now, when you're capacity building, so let's say you really, and by capacity, I mean you want to be able to do more time at a certain power or tight power range, right? There, I do recovery at 50 to 60% of threshold. I want the athlete still doing some work in there. I don't want the entire system to shut down. And when we're building capacity, part of the goal of building capacity, I don't care if they're 5 watts off the top end. I want strain on the system throughout. So I don't want too easy of recovery. And a lot of people make the mistake, they design some capacity intervals. Like I'm going to do, a set of VO2 max workouts or super threshold workouts or whatever. And my goal is I'm adding 4 more minutes this time. I'm really going to kind of just build the capacity. So as I get fit, I'm not trying to up the power. I'm trying to add time and zone, i.e. building capacity, right? But then you do those on a hill. And the reality is the further you get up the hill, because you're making longer intervals, right? And then you have longer coast time of nothing coming down. Do your capacity intervals on flats, because you don't care if you give up 5 watts because you're not going up a hill, but yet that forces you to keep pedaling at 50 to 60% in the interim period between those. So like if I do endurance intervals with my athletes, if I'm doing, sweet spot or tempo or whatever, or if I'm doing capacity building around even threshold and super threshold, I want them to do it in a way that they can produce some force in the off period. Once I flip that switch and I want power in those ranges, we go uphill. I think that answered about 4 or 5 questions, but we're going to find out. Okay, we're moving into the Q&A period. I highly recommend watching if you want to go deeper into specific modalities, specific workout examples, specific analytics to workouts, those four webinars are awesome to watch, and I would highly recommend you watch them. It's 4 hours worth of intervals, but that's why I couldn't squeeze it all into one either. I just wanted to make sure all WKO users understand our targeting and some basic ideas. I'm going to roll through questions, so if you don't want to hear me answer the questions, you can drop off now. And I'm just going to go from bottom to the top. So, Tim, with FRC intervals extensive, if able to get through 4 before failing, but then it takes 5 to 10 minutes rest and able to go through another set of 4, is that good, or should you call it after the first set? So good question, Joe. So basically what Joe is saying is, let's say you're trying to do, in its simplest terms, you're like, wow, a really good effort would be to do 8 1-minute intervals. And the athlete gets through 4 and they fail. Should they recover, maybe take 10 minutes riding around and then do another 4? If you're building capacity, if that's your purpose, that's fine. Not ideal, because it could indicate that the athlete is too fatigued to do that work, or you're over targeting. But let's assume they've kind of done it in the past and maybe just today they didn't have it. That's okay to resume. If the athlete was like, man, I was really tired at the beginning, I could barely do the first one, and I failed on number 4, no, they should wrap it up and go home. And coaches, this is why it's so important to get your athletes to understand their feelings. Intervals, it's so important in intervals to be able to understand their feelings and know when to push through and know when to go home. So it's a really tough question to specifically answer. It's situational and something you have to teach them, I guess, to do. As the athlete, if you have something left by the last set, do you go over target or keep target, but say you could have done more? So Andy, what I would do is, right, if I'm in the performance, I have 2 answers to that question, which pretty much, if you see my webinars, you should know. So if you're in this phase where you're really training to train, you're really building towards this ability to perform, I wouldn't go harder in the last interval, I'd add another interval. So you really, in this phase, want to expand capacity. So expanding time and zone should be your main focus, right? So if you could do 3 times 20 and you're like, man, I feel great, I could do another one, great, do another one. Don't go harder on the last 20 and turn it into an FTP interval, add a 4th SST interval. Once you get really into the kind of core 4 or 5 weeks of peaking, that's when you go harder. That's when you make a different decision. So I have this discussion with all my athletes. The rule of thumb here is when you feel great, add an interval. The rule of thumb here is when you feel great, go harder. Because here I want capacity. I want the underlying engine bigger and bigger and bigger so they can train stronger. Here I want that engine faster, stronger, more watts. So hopefully that answers that. If an athlete has an FTP ratio of 81 to 85% of VO2 max, then we'll have to raise the ceiling, right? Do you have a standard VO2 max workout to start that progress? Yeah, so what is being referred to here is in the VO2 max, a couple of different webinars I've shown you where you can have a measurable VO2 max. Your VO2 max is the ultimate cap to your threshold. Most athletes have about 85%, like their threshold's capped at about 85% of their VO2 max. Because the reality is VO2 max is how much oxygen you're going to kind of carry and utilize, and threshold is some lesser subset of that. So there's a point when you see your threshold grow into that kind of 82, 85 range that you're pretty capped out and you want to go raise the ceiling. You need to try to increase the VO2 max a little bit so you have a little more room to grow that threshold back. I don't have a favorite VO2 max workout. I basically follow the same principles I just showed here. But one thing I would say is purpose of those workouts are power raising. So I'm really looking at raise power at VO2 max. So I might do a slightly less higher power approach. I might, I'll go right to optimized intervals, to be honest with you. to specific situation you're asking, because it's a metabolic response that you're looking for, I would use the max aerobic work right off the get-go. It really is that simple. I shouldn't have thought about it that much. Because if you're just specifically saying what's the most effective way to raise VO2 max, improve your max aerobic power. Trying to delete as I go. Hi, is there a physiological benefit to doing intervals in erg mode, or does it not matter, assuming you can pace as well with or without being enabled? So David, I have to say this is the most often question I get the most. I literally get this question 2 to 3 times a day. There are some physiological benefits, and I actually talked about it. I did a webinar, go back and look at it about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, about indoor training, maybe it was just 3 weeks ago, about indoor training, where I spent a couple of slides answering that question. There are some benefits to doing it in erg mode. It really depends on your trainer, your hardware, what you're doing, but there are some benefits. My key answer in indoor training is do some things in erg mode and do some things on freewheel, your own power output. Blend the two. The erg mode will give you some neuromuscular advantage. Erg mode does force you to produce force against resistance instead of just create force, so it's a slightly different element. So mixing the two is the best answer. Do your training plans, like full season, include neuromuscular manipulation? Guys, I'll be very honest to everybody on here. I hate writing training plans. I do it, and I try to do it as diligently as possible, but they are general solutions, right? What the question is in my training plans, like when I sell training plans, do I use, trying to get to the right slide, neuromuscular manipulation? I do. I don't do it as enough as I really would like to in my training plans, because I really need to know the individual, right? The downside of a training plan is it's a universal answer. So I do use them some, but it's more of a universal approach towards it. As a coach, you should think more about it in most workouts. So in my one-on-one athletes, I target 3 or 4 workouts a week, have some highly specific neuromuscular manipulation. Yeah, 3 or 4 is probably right. Depends on the time of the season and exactly what it is, but it's always there, because it's just stuff that will improve, right? And I don't mean improve by suddenly you're a much better efficient pedaler and your left-right balance is right. That's whatever. You're not meant to be symmetrical. You'll never iron that out. But you improve by the way you recruit fiber, by what you're putting strain on, all the work that really happens underneath the hood. I'm trying to knock through prescription for off period. I did. Questions about the model itself, go ahead and post in Facebook. I don't want to, if you have a big difference area between PD and MMP, you got to just feel that out. So the question is being asked is, what about a persistent difference between the PD curve and the MMP curve? Let's say you have an area where the MMP is under the PD curve or vice versa. First off, I would use normalized residuals to test that athlete right there. Fix the problem underlying. And then if for some reason there still is a problem underlying, you have to be an artist and figure out which is the best target for them. Usually it's somewhere in between. Typically, though, testing in that under area will fix the problem. All right. I gave workout recommendations. Sorry, guys, I'm kind of... Okay, that's a thanks. Good. Gave progression examples. I don't know if these are the Macron charts. Answered the target. I'm going to go back to the bottom. Talking about tracking FTP versus power at aerobic capacity, and which target based on the ratio have you seen as a good reference ratio for neuromuscular versus aerobic capacity to know when to target NMPT instead of VO2 max intervals? That, Dave, is a really complex question, because you really have to break down the two systems that you're talking about. And I don't mean physiological systems. I mean, you're talking about power at aerobic capacity and you're talking about FTP. and it brings up a lot of gray area. My better answer, Dave, is find the philosophy that you work and generally follow it. What I'd be careful, that's even a cop-out answer. I'm going to let that one sit, Dave. It's too complex. Anything I say now can and will be used against me later, or we can talk about it for about 45 minutes. Post it in the Facebook group and I'll take a tackle at it there. I want to raise anaerobic capacity as well as anaerobic power. Is it okay to mix one interval in 1 week or split the build separate and give the body right impulse? No, I wouldn't do it that way because I'm a big believer in specificity. You're much better doing a short cycle. So, we tend to think a cycle is always 4 weeks. Why not make a 2-week cycle, 1 week off, 2-week cycle? So you have a 5-week variation, right? The first 2 weeks do capacity build, rest a little, and then come back and do power build. Mixing the intervals, we always think exactly as your question stated, you think you're going to get the best of both worlds, but the reality is you get the worst because you're too tired to go hard on the really day you want to go hard, right? And then the day that you go long, that's creating too much fatigue in the overall adaptation cycle. So I would split them would be my approach. Specificity in training cycles is important. I think Andy defined some rules about number of intervals based on power dropped over the successive intervals. I know there's a book out there that said, here's percentage drop off. That wasn't Andy. I personally do not believe in that. There's no number or goal. You can't do it that way. As a matter of fact, following that, in my opinion, often has you leaving excellent work on the table. The chart basically says something like, if you're down 5% from your second interval, go home. I wouldn't do that. If the athlete knows how to read their body and they're just like, oh crap, I'm done. I'm just tired. I'm too stressed, or life has been, or whatever, right? And they need to go home. They need to have the internal capability to say that. And some guidelines are good to say that. So I get the reason of a chart. Or the other problem is you as the coach have overprescribed, right? And if you're prescribing by hindsight, you can do that once, fix your problem. If you're always prescribing by hindsight, like I cracked last time, and then I went out and I tried to do it again, and I cracked again, right? And then I went out and tried to do it again, and I cracked again. Well, that's a prescription problem. Now, what's funny, I see that all the time. People send me their data. I'm like, well, I'm doing all these workouts, right? And would you do a consult for me or something like that? And I'll look at their information, and it's like, wow, you're failing on 3 out of 4 of your harder workouts. And they're okay with that because it's so important that they have the higher target, or they try to hit and achieve something versus get quality work done. So it really is, you're looking at the symptom, cure the disease, fix the prescription, understand the athlete better, use and model their power. That's all why you need a power duration model. So you remove all that bias and you have a better target. Okay, answered that one. I asked this on the WKO Power Users Forum, but hadn't gotten a response. You know what, guys? So many questions flow through there, and it's funny. Like the same order of things you see, I don't see. To me, things disappear at times, and I lose track of them, and they get lost. So if I don't get your answer, sorry about that. Oh, I get it. And this person has left. Is there a good way to plan weekly time and zone for interval workouts? Not really. Math, right? Just make sure each workout. If you know this week, this Tuesday, right now, my last, like what I do with my athletes, I just did this with my one athlete. Yesterday's work was 21 minutes of max aerobic. 21 minutes, right? Next Saturday's work, because we're on a VO2 raise cycle, is 24 minutes, which is a pretty hefty step up. But that's what I'm doing. So I make sure I write a workout that is 24 minutes at VO2 max. And I'm talking time and zone, not necessarily time at VO2 max. For this athlete, 24 minutes of time in zone will result in about 14 to 15 minutes at VO2 max, which is what you want. Somebody agreed with my progression points. Cool, thank you. Have you seen a benefit using curve under the curve individualized for mid-long course events? Jamie left too, but that's a great question. The exact place I would use the curve under curve strategy is if I was a triathlete or a triathlon coach. That's exactly why I do use it. Because I work, one of the time trialists that I work with, her her whole focus is on about 35 minutes, right? And really, we have training zones that we want to work to feed to that, but we also do a certain amount of work in that range to understand what it takes. Curve under a curve gives us deeper insight. In which way would you adapt the interval target if you chose micro Tabata high intensity? Would you target the average power for the same range of an optimized interval? That's a great question. Marcus, when I prescribe micro or Tabata intervals, I start with that. That's exactly where I go. I say, look to hit this. But I also always put the same note in that workout every single time. Don't overthink it. Just go hard when you're supposed to go hard. Go easy when you're supposed to go easy. We'll take a look at the numbers later. That's what I say every time, at every workout, every time I prescribe a micro interval workout, right? Micro intervals have a cool, unique thing to them. As long as you start with a reasonable amount of oomph, they tend to find their own watermark. You know what I mean? You're going to only recover so much. You're only going to be able to go so hard. Then I compare them once the athlete do it. Remember, these things should be descriptive. So I want to come back and compare their average and say, man, when they do micro, they're 40 watts off what the optimal intervals or the optimized interval says they should be doing. I'm going to try a steady state one and at optimized and see if they can hit it that way. That's how I find out what they can best do. Now, the reality is you might find in doing micro, they can do a little longer, meaning that could spread out to a 6-minute interval at 350 watts versus a 4-minute interval at 370 watts. You have to decide which is best. My short answer is if I'm building capacity, I'll take the longer workout. When I'm building power, I'll take the shorter. Hope that answers it. On the less intensity day, do you do longer so the overall stress is bigger? That really depends on the athlete, and that's a great, great question. And again, you're into the art of it. So, did I go by it? I did. So the question is one about training density. And what it's focused on is like if these are your intense days for a maturing athlete, you're doing 3 hard days a week. And hard doesn't mean max hard. Doesn't mean you're doing crazy 1-minute intervals, crazy 1-minute intervals, crazy 2-minute intervals or something like that. These could just be your SST, tempo, SST, whatever type of days. Harder might be a better word. The reality is on these easier intensity days, I would definitively make one longer. And the other one, here's one of my training secrets, so you can steal this note since you guys have so many people have stuck with it this deep into the questions. So let's say I would make this Sunday really long, right? This day is the athlete choice day. And this is where I work with my athletes to teach them to read their body. Where's the fatigue at? So I might prescribe 2 to 5 hours that day. It's usually not that broad. I'm kind of making an example. And I would say no intensity, we want endurance. I have a lot of neuromuscular manipulation in this. We might be doing high cadence stuff. We might be doing cadence change work. We might be doing different things, right? But I leave that athlete the ability to maybe find their way in this. Now, I don't always do that by saying just start rolling and make a decision. That always leads to trouble. But I might talk to the athlete right after this Tuesday hard workout, right? Or that morning with a quick couple of texts and say, make the decision before you get on the bike. Once on the bike, we all do this, right? Oh, the shorter answer is the better if we're tired. So the reality is I give a little bit of flexibility. So yes, I definitely make one day longer, 4 to 5 hours. There really isn't a lot of demand to go over 4 hours, particularly for a category cyclist. You just really shouldn't. You don't need a ton of it. Maybe the beginning of the year in your early base, but you don't need a ton of it. But the reality is I do make it longer and lighter. What I have learned over time is to also just make it, don't be as rigid. Like an endurance workout, let's say you have an endurance target, right? And your endurance zone in classic zone 2 is 150 to 190. Don't let the athlete go out and do 189 on those easier days. Make them do 170. There really isn't a difference in the adaptation between doing mid-range zone 2 or high range though too, because you get a little better adaptation for the high range, but you also get a lot more fatigue. You're better just staying right in the middle. Hope that answers. Here's a great one, but he left, so I'm not going to answer it. Sorry. I think here's your last chance to get a question, because I think, okay, wait. When, nope, I didn't answer it. Answered it. Answered it. You're welcome. Don't know what that one means. Dave, when you're going to talk about critical velocity in AWC in meters for using interval targeting in run or swim, again, that's complex and probably out of my, for run and swim, out of my expertise. So I'm always hesitant to answer. I think it's super smart that you're looking at that. I don't think enough people think in terms of critical velocity. As a matter of fact, I don't think people think about velocity across a large range of workout and workout measurement, but I just don't feel fully qualified to really give you a good answer. Sorry. If you ask it, ask Palladino, Steve, and Coley is another person who can translate that really well. Well, you asked a good question. Do you take consideration for heart rate in any way when prescribing and revising intervals? No. Not, well, yes, actually in prescribing, one of the things I will look at heart rate recovery as a measure of how much strain the athlete was. I'll look at heart rate cardiac drift, and I'll look at heart rate trend to put together some loose science. Heart rate recovery might be a little more of where I'll look at how quickly the heart rate recovers post interval, but all those are loose to it. In the end of the day, I tend to focus on the power because it is what creates the heart rate. I analyze with heart rate a lot, as you probably know, and as you've seen in my webinars, and I'll go back and I'll reference heart rate and I'll use heart rate to add color commentary, but prescription-wise, I tend to focus on the power. David, does training impact score have any relevance to intervals? Aerobic intervals sometimes produce a score of 10. Yeah, it has a high, intervals have a high impact. It really depends on the individual. The funny thing is the score is doing a good job of showing you the strain. People are still figuring this out, or the stress, or the strain on the system, I'm sorry. But the reality is, based on your individual power duration curve and how you make energy, that can be different between persons. VO2 max workouts, you're saying aerobic intervals, right? Let's call it max aerobic, and anything below absolutely can increase the aerobic impact. Now, when you start talking about max aerobic, right, you're bringing in a tremendous amount of anaerobic score. So what confuses people is that would actually ramp up the anaerobic score in relationship to time more. So if I showed you the athlete, I was just talking about this VO2 max workout, they're doing max aerobic 4 minutes down to 3 minutes. They also rode 3.5 hours at a very solid endurance ride because that's how they always train. She never fatigues, right? So that ended up being a 10 anaerobically because for her, she was just totally maxed out anaerobic effort. I mean, just max power it was. VO2, all the work at her VO2 max was as hard as she could go. But then she also got an 8 or a 9 aerobically because it was about 3 hours, right? And still putting in time. Plus she got some credit during those intervals for the aerobic contribution. So the thing is, right, all things come together as that. But what confuses people is the number one thing, and I said this on Facebook recently, there's no interval out there that's going to give you a 10 aerobic score in an hour. There are a group of different intervals that would give you a 10 anaerobic score in an hour. That's the nature of how those systems get strained. It's not a nature of the score. Hopefully what I just said makes sense. So it's the time component of the aerobic side that confuses people. Often they are doing something that strains the aerobic, but to really get a 10, it takes time. The aerobic system responds to time under strain. You need mitochondrial expansion. You need capillary expansion. You need strain on your heart. Your left ventricle needs to be under expansion stress and all those things over time to get an effect. Where when you're talking about the anaerobic system, bang away at that, you're changing the way the the muscle is fine, availability of fuel, ATP, all this, the anaerobic glycolysis, that happens in that process is much more quick to respond if you go intense enough. So if you think about it in closing it, training impact score of anaerobic is way more weighted with intensity, and training impact aerobic is more weighted with time, but they both certainly overlap. Hopefully that's a vague but good answer. I mean, I'm not trying to be vague, it just is, right? Those are the scores. Okay, one new question. Is there a way or reason to set up a profile for MTB, TT, and road bike on WKO5? Yeah, Jordan, if I had I would, right? Just to know, and you can do it right now. They're in there by sport types. And you can do all the work by subsports specifically. They're all under road cycling, right? But it's all subsports. I would look. The one I will tell you right there that will be different is the mountain bike, particularly if you're training with power. Mountain bike power is not only different, there's oddities in how a power meter on a mountain bike generates due to the bike's response to terrain and other factors. And that's not good or bad, and it's pretty consistent, like whenever you're mountain biking, it's always a reality. But you might have some different results. The mountain bike, I bet you, will look different enough than your TT and road bike that it's worth taking a look. Cool. I think I've answered all questions then. That was a long one. And sorry, you guys, you're going to see a lot of complaints when you go back to Facebook group. There must have been 100 or 200 people who could not get into this webinar. We're going to look to expand the size. But to be honest with you, Kevin and I pay for maintaining all the GoToWebinar and this and that. And to go to a bigger webinar set yet is like $1,000 a month, which is way more than we can afford. You don't sell software and you don't coach to get rich, trust me. So hopefully we'll figure out a better way of getting more groups in the future webinars. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. See you soon.